Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am sticking my head in the proverbial lion's den of social media discussions. Yay! Because something has come up, which, to be honest, it's an old chestnut. It comes up all the time, and that's: should politics be in stories? Should stories only be about entertainment? Should narrative be entertainment first and solely? Should politics ever have a place in narrative? And a lot of the times it's framed very much as, and to be honest, it's a slightly disingenuous question. Should stories contain politics? Well, stories contain politics, like they do. It just is a fact that there's no should about it. They do. Um, and I know people will get bent out of shape about this, but in all honesty, narrative, science fiction, fantasy, mainstream literary fiction, crime fiction, all these different types of fiction contain elements of politics. They do. It's part and parcel of writing. And I'm going to explain some aspects of this and why it is not necessarily the big deal that everyone seems to think it is, but also that these questions and comments are pushing the discussion in the wrong direction. The idea that it is about should politics be in narrative, yes or no, a binary, to my mind at least, is the wrong discussion. It's not about that. It's about how politics are integrated into stories. But let's start at the beginning. So why do I think narrative has always included politics? And if you go back to Greek myths and legends, where it talks about these kings and heroes going on quests and doing things for other kingdoms, other city-states, currying favor to get reward from various leaders, there is an inherent politics to that. And quite often, the stories, when they are told and retold, the person telling them will cater or tell the story in a certain way to potentially flatter the audience. Again, an element of populism, but think of the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, Odysseus meets his patron, Athena, but he also meets Hermes, who is his great-grandfather, because Odysseus, is it great-grandfather or grandfather? But Hermes had a son, Autolycus, the king of thieves. And I think Autolycus is Odysseus's father. Therefore, Odysseus is directly descended from Hermes. But the version of the Odyssey that we have was recorded at a time of primacy of Athens, therefore including Athena, the patron of Athens, as a central and dominant figure, would have been a more popular move. It flattered the ego of the Athenians. And that's a very savvy move for a storyteller. So buying into the politics of the day in order to make the story more popular. And you might say, oh, but the story itself wasn't about politics. Well, okay. But politics was part of the storytelling. And that's the first point that I wanted to make. Now, let's think of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's historical plays, a lot of them are heavily influenced by who was on the throne and who Elizabeth's ancestors were, what her lineage was. And Shakespeare may have been potentially slightly more flattering about certain figures from the Elizabethan sort of line. And if you, like, I'm not a Shakespeare scholar, go and find a Shakespeare scholar and they will start picking apart all of Shakespeare's plays to show you the different elements that tie into the politics of the day, the court politics of the day, how Shakespeare was doing populist things or political things within the texts. And there's a huge amount of that in Shakespeare. I just don't know it off the top of my head because I'm not a Shakespeare scholar. But I do know Shakespeare scholars who have told me this stuff in the past, and it's just gone out of my head. But even if we think of Dante's Inferno, in which people who Dante didn't like ended up in hell, certain political figures ended up in hell. That was political commentary in the middle of Dante's Inferno. Milton's Paradise Lost. During Cromwell, think of how that actually figures into the construction of Lucifer as an anti-hero. The politics of the day heavily influenced the writing and editing of Paradise Lost. So that aspect of politics, conforming to what the current contemporary audience wanted, or to flatter or seek approval from certain aspects of the audience of the day, has been part of storytelling, and it's something that no one really has an issue with. It's a popular narrative form. You appeal to your audience, and you seek approval from those who can reward you. So that's an aspect of storytelling. And I don't think Paradise Lost would have been a better epic poem if there had been no element of politics to it. But again, that's going back quite a bit in time. So let's think of some slightly more modern examples of politics, and why the presence of politics in novels is not an inherently bad thing. For a start, we have a whole subgenre of political thrillers that are based in politics, and so if you say we shouldn't have politics in story, they should only be entertaining, are you saying that that entire subgenre of political thrillers is not entertaining for anyone? Because it's a commercial subgenre, it sells incredibly well, and it's full of politics. Like it's in the title, political thriller. So that as an entire subgenre is dependent on politics. But why don't we move away from that aspect and go, oh, well, what about just straightforward politics, exposing and investigating the politics of today? The West Wing was a massively popular TV show that was overtly political. It appealed to an international and mainstream audience. It was focused on American politics. It dealt with some difficult political issues of the time in which it was being written. And yeah, some of it was really good, some of it was poorly done, but that was a wildly popular show that appealed to people. House of Cards, the books obviously were focused on the UK system, and there was a UK adaptation, but then there was the American adaptation where it was transplanted into the US, and it involved political skullduggery in the US. It talked about political scandals. It investigated these things. It was all about US politics and the Machiavellian machinations behind the scenes, created this whole complex web or House of Cards. Wonder where they got that title from. But that is, again, overtly political and was dealing with political issues that were relevant to the time in which that adaptation was being written. But even something that is not ostensibly a show set in politics, we had Boston Legal. Boston Legal was a comedy. Denny Crane was a Republican character. Alan Shore was a Democrat character. And it was a Boston law firm. But every episode, because it was episodic, was focused on law, an investigation of law, challenging laws. All of those aspects are inherently political because it was about laws that had been proposed or enacted by one party and were being challenged by the other. There was a lot of political debate about the merits of these laws, the investigation of these laws, the challenging or support of these laws. And it was done in a comedy. It was done for entertainment, but there were strong elements of political discussion interwoven throughout all of that because law and politics are intertwined. And this is not even going into the entire genre of dystopian fiction. When we take Orwell's 1984, which was an extrapolation from an investigation of the dominant sort of political philosophies of 1948 or thereabouts, and looking at the ramifications of these different abuses of power and control of citizens. Deeply political, overtly political. And a lot of what Orwell talked about in 1984 clearly has a strong resonance for today, but also Huxley's Brave New World, which I think was it 1937? Maybe. But Huxley's Brave New World about how technology and mass consumerism and consumption was going to change how society was functioned. The fact that Ford is the dominant figure in control. He is the controller. Ford, the company, talking about consumer capitalism and the power of corporations to dominate life. All of that intensely political. We could even talk about Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 and censorship and the control of populace through what they are allowed to read, which, given that people seem to think we shouldn't have politics in stories, seems to be a pretty important point. That stories and literature in that culture, different ways of exploring different perspectives, different ways of challenging our own personal views, different ways of exploring and maybe even reinforcing views that we actually already hold. Like, all of that is part of a political discourse about the control of a populace, the education of a populace. It is an intensely political novel. And I don't think literature would be enriched if we got rid of dystopian novels. And then we can move on to thought experiment novels, or novels that extrapolate very specifically different trends and aspects. And we see a lot of this in science fiction. Ursula Le Guin's fiction is full of this. The Dispossessed, The Left Hand of Darkness, and the sort of the short story sequel, Coming of Age in Carhide. That's looking at political systems, gender in society, how society is structured around various perceptions of gender and social structures. All of that deeply political. And seeing authors today write stories like that, that's continuation of a well-established form. Politics is inherent to a lot of narrative. But let's think about things that are not meant to be sort of intellectual, that things that are just entertainment. Star Wars, deeply fascistic, overreaching, controlling empire that is evil, is taken down by the scrappy young insurgents of the Rebel Alliance. The individual fighters for individual freedom of expression and who want a proper democracy try to take down an evil dictatorship. That is a political storyline. And then when you consider the context of a sort of post-Vietnam War era in the States, you can see how there are certain allegorical elements to Star Wars beyond the articulation of Star Wars as, say, the hero's journey, which everyone goes on about. But we can consider a lot of what happens in Star Wars and how it was played with to have a deeply political message and to be commenting on politics. It's not the only way to read the film, but it's certainly present. Or we could think of Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn. Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn, again, scrappy young insurgents taking out an evil overlord. Then the struggle to incorporate democracy. Oh, yay, democracy is great, except no, it's not. It's terrible. It's corrupt. It's always going to be corrupted. People will always manipulate it. What we need is a benevolent dictator because that's good. And you can see trends of political thought run through Sanderson's YA series of Mistborn, the first era, the first trilogy. That a lot of that is deeply political. There's politics inherent in the entire discussion of how to be a good ruler, what makes a good ruler. That's a central aspect of one of the novels, Lessons on How to Rule. We see it in the Stormlight archives as well, explorations of what makes a good ruler. I'm sorry, how to rule, how to control a populace is a key aspect of what politics is. That is inherently political. Talking about the economics of a fantasy world and how that works, whether you have a merchant class and a class system inherent in the structure of the society of the story world, that has a political dimension. The exploration of capitalism, the exploration of mercantile capitalism versus a form of industrial capitalism, all those things can be deeply political in a story world. And we could even discuss aspects of, say, Stephen Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, where a lot of different societal structures, cultures, governmental types are discussed, constructed, and deconstructed, are critiqued, not to come up with, oh, this is the best way of doing things, but to consider different political aspects. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of politics in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. But let's say, oh no, but we're not talking about those ones. The Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind, deeply political and politically motivated for a particular strand of politics. Not only the actions of the hero, but the construction of the story world, the critique of the old world versus the new order, all of these sorts of things, the inclusion of certain storylines and certain events are articulations and examples and literalizations of aspects of certain political thought. Terry Goodkind's work is intensely political. And we can contrast that very neatly, actually, with almost the flip side, the far end of the political spectrum that we find in China Miéville's work, which again, Miéville deconstructs and interrogates aspects of politics, particularly politics that he found lacking in a lot of genre fantasy and wanted to play with in the world of Bas Lag. And Miéville's work is brilliant. And you wouldn't say, oh, you shouldn't have politics in fantasy stories. You're going to alienate some people. There's nothing anyone can write that is going to be engaging, that isn't going to alienate someone. You can't write for all people. And politics being a scapegoat for this, it just isn't true. Politics is just one more thing that people will complain about, but people will complain about anything and everything in narrative. You only need to look on the fascinating reviews that appear on Goodreads to see weird things that people say make a book a 1 star. Even when we, by analogy, let's sidestep out of politics for a second. Talking about tropes. Oh, I hate tropes. I hate it when a book is tropey. Tropes are the building blocks of narrative. All narratives have tropes. What generally people are complaining about is not only that a trope is present, but it has been badly done. Because if the trope is present and it is well done, quite often you don't notice it. You don't complain about it. Or you go, oh, I noticed that after the fact. I went, oh, that's actually a really good way to do it. Why couldn't everyone do it that way? And if everyone did it that way, it would just become just as cliched. But the presence of the trope is not the bad thing. It's how it is being used. But we'll tackle now, very briefly, the thorny issue of identity politics, because the personal is political. And it is a hot button issue. And I'm not trying to rile people up. But when we think of issues of politics, the inclusion of certain types of characters, backgrounds of characters, sexual orientation of characters, and that is viewed as a political move, that someone included this as a political move. Very well, the author may have intended it as a political move. But if you regard the inclusion of those characters as political, then the exclusion of those characters is equally political, but in the opposite direction, reactionary or small c conservative, as opposed to liberal or progressive. That it's on the same spectrum, it's just on the other end. So not having those characters is also a political position if you regard having those characters as a political position. And when we see works like N.K. Jemison's The Broken Empire, or The Broken Earth, sorry. Oops. N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy. the fifth season being the first book. There are intensely political aspects to Jemisin's writing, and it is fabulous. It is amazing, and it delves deep into aspects of culture and the structures of society and power structures inherent in culture, society, and governance. And all of those things are intensely political. And the story is richer for it. Politics is part and parcel of the world we inhabit, the very air that we breathe. This narrative soup that we are surrounded by is permeated by politics. And when authors choose to include something or not include something, to provide us with an element of mimesis, to give us something with which to sort of hang our willing suspension of disbelief on, quite often there are politics inherent in that choice, or that are expressing a certain type of politics. Because if you think about it, politics applies to the structure and control of societies and cultures and how they are ruled over or maintained by a power. So monarchies, empires, all of those are inherently political structures. And those are going to be part and parcel of your book. People buying and selling things are going to be elements of capitalism, which is going to work into economy, which again, if tax is part of it, is going to be political. And so when we think of the established norms of a world and how they echo or challenge or support aspects of our own world, there will be political elements to an awful lot of it. And some of them are there intentionally, some of them are there unintentionally, some are conscious, some are unconscious. But politics is part of the fabric and weave of narrative. And its mere presence is not bad. A story that focuses on it is not inherently bad. A story that utilizes it is not inherently bad. A story that is focused on and playing with it is not inherently bad. I've given examples of all of these different types of narratives that use politics in different ways, that are focused on politics in different ways. And regardless of whether or not we personally like or dislike specific individual works, we can still think of other people who did enjoy them and go, yeah, therefore politics has a place in narrative. So should it be there? Yes, it should. But that's the wrong question, because you can't get rid of it. It's always going to be there. And I think ultimately this comes down to how we perceive politics, what we think of as politics, how we're defining politics. Because if someone said to you, The Lord of the Rings is a political novel, a political story, you might go, no, it isn't. But there's an attitude prevalent in it about the placement of men within the world and the placement of women, social structures, and how people should act. That has an inherently political dimension. But even if you don't think that that's strong enough to call it a political novel, what about the environmentalist message, the tree-hugging hippie green message of Tolkien? Like, that is clearly evident, and we know that environmentalism is considered political. Therefore, that is a political message. The protection of the environment, the beauty of nature, all of that is inherent in Tolkien's work, very deliberately so. So that is political. And if that's not enough, what about the scouring of the Shire and the criticism that Tolkien has for industrialization and industrial capitalism, which again is an inherently political position? That is politics. That is in his text. And so politics, depending on how you define it, is part of narrative. It is part of our world. It is part of worlds that are created by other human beings, because we import things. We have our biases and perception filters that get applied. All of that can have a political dimension. And when you start thinking of story structures and what is going on in a story, we can isolate political movements. When you look at those elements of how nations are being governed in fantasy, then that is an element of politics. If the chosen one is the heir to the throne and the rightful heir and Dieu mon droit, and is the blessed one who's destined to rule because of his lineage. That's hearkening back to a very explicit form of politics. That is politics. It's just maybe not politics that you care about. And that keeps coming up as a distinction. It is almost never the fact that politics are present. Quite often, it is the fact that it is politics we dislike are present. So it's not never put politics in. It's never put in politics that I don't like. But no author in the world can write a story that is going to avoid political thought that every single reader is going to agree with or disagree with. Like you can't do it. You can't control all of your readers. You can't mind read all of them. Politics will always be part of narrative. And so asking the question, should it be there, I think is a useless question. What I think is far more interesting is how is politics being incorporated, particularly in that text that you object to it? Why is it that specific example is rubbing you the wrong way? When, if you think about it, what they did in that is unlikely to be on its own as a niche case. It's likely to have appeared in lots of other texts, probably some that you've also enjoyed. So why is it that one? What is it about that thing? And is it its inherent presence or how it's been articulated? There's lots of room for discussion. The meat on those bones for discussion is actually really fascinating. But a discussion over should politics be in fantasy? Should politics be in science fiction? That's over in seconds, yes. Done, move on. But thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support. I really do appreciate it, especially those people who have taken the time to leave comments. I really love that. And those people who have so generously donated and bought me a coffee on the coffee link. I find it very difficult to articulate quite how grateful I am. So thank you very much. But thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.